last video, we discussed the rise of the period known as the Atlantic Revolutions from the perspective of the American Revolution and the French Revolution. So what we're going to do in this video is to shift back across the Atlantic to the Caribbean to talk about the influence of these new kinds of ideas, these new revolutionary ideas that were coming out of the Enlightenment and the American and French revolutions, and how they affected the other colonies in the New World. And so what we'll start with is the Haitian Revolution. So the Haitian Revolution is roughly dated from 1791 to 1804. And so in order to understand it, you have to understand a little bit about the background of Haiti. So Haiti was a French territory, it was a French colony. And it was primarily organized around sugar production. Sugar plantations had been the backbone of the Caribbean and much of Latin America, and specifically Brazilian colonies. And sugar had transformed the European economy. There was a tremendous amount of demand for sugar, and sugar was a labor-intensive, back-breaking crop to grow. And so what happens in these Caribbean possessions, Caribbean colonies, and Brazil, is that pretty much everything is organized around these sugar plantations. There's this constant push for productivity and efficiency, keeping the costs down, and they relied heavily on slave labor to do that. So in Haiti, the vast majority of the population of this French colony, which was called Saint-Domingue at the time, was a slave population. The sugar plantations in Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, produced about 40% of Europe's sugar and 60% of Europe's coffee, making it one of France's most valuable overseas territories or overseas protectorates, their possessions. So you have to understand that background in order to understand where the Haitian Revolution came from. So because Haiti is a possession, it's a colony of France, you'll remember that France in 1789 underwent its own revolution. And the slogan for the French Revolution focused on liberty, fraternity, and equality. And that last concept, the concept of equality, was hard to reconcile with race-based slavery as it existed in the French colonies in the New World, particularly in Saint-Domingue or Haiti. So as these ideas of liberty, fraternity, and equality grew in popularity in France, increasingly people began to question this concept of whether it was actually being applied equally. So in May of 1781, the National Assembly gave full French citizenship to all free men of color. Note that this does not include slaves, but all free men of color in the French territories. This created social conflict or race-based conflict in Saint-Domingue because there were a group there were kind of two categories of French citizens or white Europeans living in Saint-Domingue. There were the Grands, which were the elite, and the Petit Blanc, who were the kind of poorer white inhabitants of Saint-Domingue. And many of these Petit Blanc, many of these non-elite people of European ancestry, of French ancestry living in Saint-Domingue, felt that this declaration or this giving of the rights of citizenship to free men of color impinged on their rights. So there's resentment there. There's also resentment from the slave population, which made up the majority not just of Saint-Domingue's population of color, but of the entire population of Saint-Domingue in general. So there's a lot of tension taking place, or building up after the 1791 decision. So what happens in 1791 is that Saint-Domingue enters into the first phase of the Haitian Revolution. And the Haitian Revolution, this first phase, is a slave revolt. It was led by a man named Toussaint Louverture, and he helped mold this slave population, which again made up the majority of the population in the colony, into an effective army, an army that could withstand attacks from French troops. They were aided by the Spanish and the British, And finally, in 1794, the French revolutionary government, known as the National Convention, was forced to recognize this reality. And so they emancipated the slaves, extending this concept of equality to all men of color in Saint-Domingue, in their colonies. As a result of this decision, Louverture switched his allegiance to France to help them fight the British and the Spanish and help turn the tide of war. So, in this first phase, the slaves were freed, but they still continued to work in sugar plantations, only this time for pay. So much of the economy proceeded in terms of sugar and coffee production as it had before, proving to be beneficial to France. And then in 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte moves into position. So he had originally been one of the 3 consuls for the consulate, then he declared himself sole consul, so just one consul, and then consul for life. So by 1799, Napoleon has essentially taken control of France and by extension Haiti. And he wants to increase sugar production and efficiency, which created a lot of debate and uncertainty. Was he thinking about returning slavery to Haiti? So in 1799, the second phase of the Haitian Revolution emerged, and it lasts from 1799 to 1804. And it resulted in, or it's basically defined by this fight for independence, where the colonists in Saint-Domingue wanted full independence from France. The French were exceedingly cruel in this war, executing women and children as well as men. Some stories suggest that they imported what were called man-eating dogs from Cuba. And so they brutalized the inhabitants of Saint-Domingue. But the Haitians fought back, and they had, kind of one of the best defenses of all, or one of the best allies of all, which was disease. Epidemics of yellow fever swept through French army bases, killing thousands of soldiers, officers, and infantry alike. In 1804, Napoleon was forced to admit defeat and recalled the surviving troops. And at that time, of the 40,000 soldiers who left France, only 8,000 made it back. In 1804, Napoleon pretty much washed his hands of the Western Hemisphere, deciding to focus on Europe and the European continent. 1803, he sold the Louisiana Territory to the United States. In 1804, he recognized Saint-Domingue's independence. Saint-Domingue renamed itself as Haiti, which had been what the Native Americans called the island prior to the arrival of the French. And it was the first successful slave rebellion or slave revolution in modern history. It foiled Napoleon's dreams of having a huge world empire. And perhaps even more significantly, it inspired other revolutions and independence movements across the Caribbean and Latin America. So the last phase of the Atlantic revolutions focuses on the Latin American revolutions, which took place from 1810 to 1824. The most significant of these revolutions was probably the Mexican Revolution, which lasted from 1810 to 1821. It resulted in the overthrow of Spain and in the independence of Mexico, and really kind of reset the stage, or reframed North America. So that by 1824, Europe had lost most of its possessions in North and South America, in the so-called New World. England was still holding on to some territory, but even they had lost the 13 colonies. And these independence movements, these new governments, would shape the 19th century in some unique ways, so that the relationship between the U.S. and Mexico had profound ramifications for both nations and for the way that the 19th century developed. So we'll tell that story a little bit later. Thank you for your attention.